Hello, my evil hags. My name is Mina. Oh, Jesus Christ. Just to preface, I do have a minor cold. I don't know why I'm surprised because Fashion Week just happened and I always get some kind of sickness after Fashion Week. So I guess I should have better prepared for that. But yeah, if I sound a little nasally or just not like myself, or if I'm coughing as I'm speaking, I'm going to try to edit out all the coughs. But yeah, just letting you know I'm sick. So today we're going to be doing a video on fairy tale costuming. I feel like I haven't done a historical related costuming video in a super long time. So I'm excited to go back to my roots, go back to what brought me here to begin with, to this platform. And yeah, let's get to it. I'm going to make a blanket statement here and say that most of us have probably grown up with some kind of fairy tale education, whether that be in the form of books or oral tradition or Disney movies. My favorite fairy tale growing up was Rumpelstiltskin, and I'm still waiting for a Disney movie on that. I'm not sure why they haven't done one. And my favorite fairy tale Disney movie was Beauty and the Beast. A lot of Western fairy tales share a lot of common tropes and themes, and the reason is because they generally have the same source material, which are medieval romances. Common tropes defining medieval romance, which carry over to fairy tales, include courtly love, chivalry, rags to riches / royalty, wicked mother figures, etc. And like all tropes, these tropes reflected societal ideals of the time. For example, at the same time that courtly love and chivalry were major literature tropes, in 1399, there was a chivalric order founded by Jean II Le Monge and a group of knights called Emprise de l'Escu vers à la Dame Blanche. The stated purpose of the order was to guard and defend the honor, estate, goods, reputation, fame, and praise of all ladies. When it comes to female character tropes, whenever there's a heroine in medieval literature, her goodness is always juxtaposed by another woman's badness. We see this all the time in fairy tales: Cinderella and Lady Tremaine, Aurora and Maleficent, Ariel and Ursula, etc. So for this video, what I really want to dive into specifically is how semi-historical costuming characterizes heroines and villainesses. Okay, let's get into it, but first I need a little snack. Figuring out what to cook for myself is sometimes the biggest chore ever. I go to classes, I work, and some days I don't do anything and I still don't have the energy. HelloFresh makes sustaining yourself as easy as it can be. They provide easy-to-follow recipes as well as fresh, high-quality ingredients pre-measured for stress-free meal planning for you, your partner, and/or your family. On their website, you can select your weekly recipes, modify the servings per recipe, and schedule delivery at your convenience. And of course, you can pause or cancel your subscription at any time. There's a wide variety of recipes available, as well as dietary options like vegetarian or family-friendly, so you can always find something that suits your needs. I picked the meat and veggies option, so these are the 3 recipe cards they sent me, and as you can see, I ended up picking the creamy Dijon dill chicken to make tonight, but I am super excited to try the other ones out in the next few days. I've used HelloFresh a couple times now, and one thing you can always count on is their sauce recipes. No joke. Using my code, you'll get 65% off if you live in the US, but wherever you're watching from, you'll get a very special discount if you use my code or link, as it's valid internationally. So, let's talk about fairy tale films and what characterizes them. Fairy tale films are usually historically inaccurate, which makes sense because they are in a fantasy world. They're usually in a vaguely European setting in a vaguely medieval / Renaissance time period. Nothing is exact, and therefore we can't really judge too harshly what's going on with the costuming. Also, something to note is that most fairy tale films also use women's characterization in medieval romance as a means of either upholding or subverting traditional femininity. Disney's older princess movies, for instance, have a reputation for upholding traditional femininity. For example, if we take a look at Disney's Snow White, which came out in 1937, and Disney's Sleeping Beauty, which came out in 1959, the princesses are framed as being passive, dependent, and self-sacrificial. We see how Snow White is depicted as naive and childlike and how easily she is tricked into eating the poison apple. Aurora is just forced to do whatever her fairy godmothers tell her and loses agency completely when put under Maleficent's spell. These princesses are also damsels in that they're only saved when the prince comes to rescue them with true love's kiss. I mean, there's a lot of discourse about how Disney movies or Disney princess movies weren't feminist or whatever, but, you know, that makes sense because when these movies were released in the early to mid 20th century, they were upholding what were the ideals for women at that time period. Women were expected to raise children, and they were expected to not work, and they were expected to have a certain level of femininity in the way that they presented themselves. And yet, what I do want to give Disney credit for is that their adaptations are still considerably tamer than the source material. Fairy tale patriarchs, the Grimms, were a little obsessed with feminine suffering, to be honest. In their versions of Snow White, Cinderella, and Rapunzel, the princesses' mothers explicitly die in childbirth, having served their societal duties by producing a beautiful daughter to replace them. As Maddie Crum writes, although men are also the subjects of execution in the tales, their deaths are disproportionately the result of some sort of legal trial proving their guilt, whereas their female counterparts are violently discarded by nature's whims. So, violence against women is illustrated as a harsh fact of life, whereas brutalities against men require logical justification. Ruth B. Bodenheimer cataloged the speech patterns of fairy tale characters in her book, Grimm's Bad Girls and Bold Boys, the moral and social vision of the tales. And she found that there's this explicit shushing of women throughout these stories. Women are casted with spells of silence, and the female characters that are most prized by male suitors tend to be the ones that speak less. At least with Disney, they kind of removed all the emphasis on female violence, and their princesses have some degree of personality rather than just being story props. Also, the Washington Post conducted a study in 2016 that revealed that earlier Disney films divided up dialogue between princesses and princes pretty equally. So, late 20th and 21st century fantasy films tend to be more subversive, reflecting changing societal ideals towards womanhood. Some films like Ella Enchanted, Ever After, and Monty Python explicitly include modern commentary about their own settings in a, oh ho, we're so much more progressive than what you were expecting kind of way.
Listen, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. Shut up! Will you shut up? Now we see the violence inherent in the system. Shut up!
Greta Austin writes, in fairy tales, medieval protagonists are shown to be different from their peers, possessing desires and expectations that mark them out as proleptically modern. For example, Danielle in Ever After tells Prince Henry that she's read Thomas More's Utopia, which came out in 1516.
If you suffer your people to be ill-educated and their manners corrupted from infancy, and then punish them for those crimes to which their first education disposed them, what else is to be concluded, sire, but that you first make thieves and then punish them?
While it wasn't strange for a noblewoman to get education from childhood, the fact that she was treated like a servant by her stepmother makes me think she probably wasn't given a proper education. But obviously, good education is a 21st century feminist ideal, and so having Danielle be this smart, well-read, activist type of girl appeals to the modern girls watching this movie.
Ella, Afro, you are not like other girls.
So that's just a bit of a tangent, but let's get into the costumes. Costuming operates in two major ways in fantasy films. One, they help ground the setting in a environment that we're familiar with, and two, they characterize the characters. In medieval historian Paul Sturtevant's study on the influence of fairy tales on participants' understanding of the Middle Ages, he notes, many participants felt medieval costume was a central feature in what makes something seem medieval to them. But the costumes in these films are not universally medieval, they are hybrids of different periods. Yeah, I've noticed that watching a lot of fantasy fairy tale films, the costumes range from being medieval inspired to Renaissance inspired to even being Victorian inspired. Sometimes it just looks like the costume designer was desperate to find costumes for the ensemble cast and just went to a costume rental house and picked up anything that looked vaguely historical. But at the end of the day, that's fine. It's fantasy. Actually, you know what? Scratch that, because when I say I'm not a stickler for historical accuracy in fairy tale films, is because at the end of the day, I know it's not worth me feeling a type of way about a made-up world in a made-up time period. But With that said, I think it's like irritating sometimes how people will take what they see in a fantasy film to inform what they themselves know as history. So not to pick at low-hanging fruit, but it's like literally the only example I can think of on the spot, the corset. And I've made a whole video on corsets. There's so many videos on YouTube by fashion historians on corsets and our misconceptions of the corset. Long story short, tight lacing, more of a myth than an actual practice. But when we see tight lacing in a medieval-ish fantasy film, we're not thinking like, oh, tight lacing is the fantasy part of the film. No, like we're thinking goblins and dragons are the fantasy part of the film. And when we see something like tight lacing or people wearing garments that actually existed, but maybe just not in a correct way, because those garments existed in real life, we perceive it as just like, that's something that they took from history. That's something that is historically true that they borrowed for this movie. Does that make sense? So yeah, I just want to clarify that. The question I really want to ask is, why do so many fairy tales or fantasy films rely on like medieval aesthetics? What about the Middle Ages is so appealing? And yes, we can say that some of these fairy tales derive from medieval stories, and, you know, a story like Snow White is obviously going to have a more historical background. But even when just looking at movies like Game of Thrones, TV shows like Game of Thrones or movies like The Lord of the Rings, these are made up fantasy worlds, and yet they rely a lot on medieval costuming elements. So why is that? Well, as Martha Driver and Sid Wright posit, the Middle Ages has always been a site of heroic fantasy, producing a wide range of heroic character types who quest and battle for various causes. Fairy tales thus look to a simpler and medieval-ish past to create a time of romance, adventure, and magic. The medieval world has also symbolized a place and time before the complications of technology and urbanization. Clothing was and is still a prime signifier of social class. For example, all throughout history, nobility and royals would wear lush, heavy, expensive, dyed fabrics to show that they are not people who labor. They cannot move in their 50-pound dresses. Like, that's not happening. They have maids, they have servants. They're not lifting one finger, and they are going to show it with their clothes. There was also a thing called sumptuary laws, which also helped establish this clothing hierarchy. These types of laws have existed all over the world at numerous time periods throughout history, but the general idea of them was a way for the government to control spending. But subsequently, it did lead to discriminatory practices. For example, in England in 1337, Edward III ruled that no one below the rank of knight could wear fur. And in 1583, Henry III of France decreed that the wearing of precious stones and pearls on garments was restricted to princes. So let's get into princesses and see how most of them tend to be dressed at the beginning of the movie. The most popular starter heroine outfit is the peasant dress, because a lot of them start off the story as peasants, or princesses that are forced to work as peasants by their evil stepmothers. These movie peasant dresses look really cute, honestly, though in reality, medieval and Renaissance peasants would have just worn the most basic functional clothing. Their clothes were made of wool or linen and probably neutral in color, as dyes costed more money. Plus, Edward III of England actually passed a sumptuary law that restricted farming folk to wearing natural wool tone and russet, and by tradition, they continue to wear those colors into the 20th century. And as for the garment layering in this time period, your base layer would be a chemise or smock that was full length for women, and your second layer would be a loose fitted kirtle. Nobility also wore kirtles, but they were more fitted and of course nicer in fabric and color. Fitted garments wasted fabric and were therefore impractical for the peasant class, who were restricted by fabric expense and sumptuary laws. So if we take a look at Danielle from Ever After, her peasant dress consists of a white chemise, a blue kirtle, an apron, and attached sleeves. They actually mention in the movie that it takes place in 16th century France, so we do have more explicitly a Renaissance costume featured in this movie. Her kirtle laces in the front, which is somewhat realistic because being a peasant, she wouldn't have had a maid to lace them in from the back. But I will say I've seen this detached sleeve style only worn by gentlewomen in paintings, but that's a nitpick. We still get the vibe that she's a servant girl at the end of the day. Aurora's peasant look is straight up 1950s ready-to-wear with an overbodice that is vaguely reminiscent of a German dirndl. A laced kirtle would look more like this and would have spiral lacing rather than crisscross lacing. Snow White's peasant dress is even more historically offensive with a Peter Pan collar and puffed sleeves. So yeah, I'm not going to get into it too deep because it's pretty obvious that Disney films were leaning towards contemporary fashion trends to make their princesses more appealing to modern audiences. For Ella of Ella Enchanted, her costume is incredibly modern, definitely looking like a Ren Fair costume that you could throw together with regular clothes from your own closet. Like Snow White and Sleeping Beauty, Ella Enchanted is not focused on the historical accuracy, it's just simply trying to evoke a medieval vibe. As Kari Marin writes, this narrative strategy enables what Robinson and Clements call neo-medievalism, which is further independent, further detached from the Middle Ages than is medievalism. It consciously, purposefully, and perhaps even laughingly reshapes itself into an alternate universe of medievalisms, a fantasy of medievalisms, a meta-medievalism. But whether these films claim to be medieval or simply neo-medieval, the peasant dress signifies the heroine's humble origins, characterizing her as virtuously down-to-earth. But of course, the often bold colors, the makeup, the hairstyle, and the fit of the garments keep her from looking too dowdy. We want to create the illusion of work, not have her actually work. Even modern incarnations of the peasant dress, like Yves Saint Laurent's Russian folklore collection in 1976, and the Gunny Sacks peasant chic boom throughout that decade, and even the more recent cottagecore phenomenon, these are all giving romance, simple living, and a flair for the provincial. And like in these movies, these fashion trends also tend to glamorize a laboring lifestyle. Hindeman Auction writes of the Russian collection, Saint Laurent envisioned the Russian peasant class with a sense of ease and detached nostalgia during a time of global tensions between the Soviet bloc and the West. By the end of the movie, the heroine usually experiences some kind of glow up and has a matching glow up dress to drive home that point. Usually this final dress is more decorated, and I've also noticed in some cases it's more contemporary in design as well. What are you doing? For example, in the fairy tale movie Stardust, the setting is roughly around the 1800s and takes place in two worlds, Victorian England and the fairy world, the latter which is neo-medieval. Yvain, the heroine of the story, first appears wearing a medieval-ish silver gown that looks reminiscent of a 1300s kirtle and boots that are reminiscent of the Victorian era. She later changes into a more Victorian-looking dress with a bustle. The choice to go Victorian for her costuming reflects the growing relationship between Yvain and the English Victorian hero Tristan and signifies the convergence of these two worlds. Similarly, Ella Enchanted's Ella takes it a step further. She starts off wearing a neo-medieval ensemble, but the gown she wears during the movie's climax has a basque bodice, which was more popular during the Victorian era. And even as I say that, I know it's giving the dress a little bit too much credit because it really just looks like a prom dress, and the dress is also constructed of an iridescent organza, which mirrors early 2000s trends. And the final dress that she wears during the iconic Don't Go Breaking My Heart sequence is a straight up 60s revival 2000s dress. The choice to modernize her wardrobe this severely really drives home the class transformation within the narrative. She's a princess now within the story, but also the contemporary styling emphasizes her beauty and virtue to modern day audiences. The last dance sequence also served as kind of a fourth wall break. It's like telling us that the movie is over now, so let's just dance and have fun. So the Morgan Library has this really cool online exhibition called Illuminating Fashion, Dress in the Art of Medieval France and the Netherlands that explores the evolution of courtly clothing from the fashion revolution around 1330 to the flowering of the Renaissance in France in 1515. It's just like a really cool exhibition. It's also just like online and free, so I highly recommend checking it out if you're into medieval clothing. But yeah, there's this one section that's titled Tormentors Are Always Well Dressed. They write in the section, it was an unwritten rule for medieval artists that Christ was never fashionable. The opposite, however, applied to torturers and executioners, whose foppish obsession with elegant clothing was a reflection of their depravity. We see elaborate costumes hinting at a villain or villainess's vanity, especially in Disney films. One clothing element that's popular for villainesses is the horned hennin, which is a dual conical hat that often has a veil as well. These hats were actually popular for wealthy women in the mid to late 1400s. Height of the hennin also indicated social class, and in some regions, there were sumptuary laws in place that restricted wearing the hennin to people of wealth. Headwear during this time period was essential. If you were a young unmarried woman, you could get away with like having your locks out and about. But if you were a married woman with uncovered hair, scandalous, canceled, whore. Despite the fact that at the time, these hats were literally just like trendy headwear. They didn't signify an evil, demonic nature within the wearer. They've become a popular headwear choice for villains because they kind of resemble devil horns. For example, Maleficent of Sleeping Beauty wears a stylized horned hennin, and the Baroness Rodmilla de Ghent in Ever After wears an extremely pointy version that is actually really similar to the one in this Portrait of Isabella of Portugal, painted by Roger van der Weyden in 1450. So yeah, Jenny Beavan kind of went off with Ever After costuming, I must say. Even though, once again, like I want to emphasize that people wore these for fashion. It wasn't like a sign of evilness. I guess you could still make an argument that having a garment that signified extreme wealth in a time of extreme inequality is immoral. Actually, some moralist groups of this time period criticized the hennin for this very reason. In Accessories of Dress, an illustrated encyclopedia, the authors write, "The extravagances of headwear in the late 15th century was so notorious that it prompted the retaliation of a number of religious and moralist groups of the time, who likened the shape of some pieces of headwear to a goat or ram, animals which were strongly associated with Baphomet, a deity representative of the devil." And ultimately, the negative connotation of the hennin ushered in its downfall as a fashion trend. The Morgan Library exhibition also notes, "This headgear of the Whore of Babylon, pictured, can go no further. It is as tall and its burlet as close together as can be. By 1470, it was seen as not just old-fashioned, but also decadent." So yeah, in the case of fairy tale films, the horned hennin does add this like visual demonic representation to a villainess, but also they look very medieval, and so it alienates us, the audience, from relating to her as easily as the heroine who is usually dressed in a more contemporary way. Another common villainous garment is that of the standing pointed collar, often attached to a cape. In tropes vocabulary, people refer to this design as the high collar of doom. The Evil Queen in Snow White and Maleficent in Sleeping Beauty wear this garment. For the Evil Queen, her pointed standing collar also juxtaposes with Snow White's rounded standing collar. The Evil Queen actually shares a lot of similar design elements as Snow White, but everything about her is more severe, more cutting, while Snow's is softer, more childlike, more cherubic. Once again, this was an actual trend in Europe during medieval times. The more historically accurate ensemble version consisted of a partlet with a standing collar that was often attached to a hoopland. A hoopland is a specific kind of medieval overgown, which was widely worn in the late 14th century and 15th century. It could have a number of different sleeve types and collared styles, but the ones we're looking at look like this one in the painting Portrait of a Princess from 1420. Like the horned hennin, because of the excessive amount of fabric that was used to construct these hooplands, they ended up having this connotation with conspicuous consumption and the immoral noble class. Dracula is a male character who also famously wears a standing collar, at least in the 1924 and 1931 stage and film adaptations. In Dracula's case, the costume served a more functional purpose. Stanley Stepanek writes, "The collar's purpose was to hide the actor's head for the same disappearing tricks used on stage in the 19th century. By raising the enlarged collar and descending the head, the actor would be able to slink away into secret doors in the wall as their cape fell to the ground as though they disappeared." As the play made its way to the United States, this aspect of the cape was simply part of the play version of Dracula's costume, and it remained. Another example of a standing collar wearer is Hattie, who is Ella's evil stepsister in Ella Enchanted. Hers is a modernized, exaggerated version of the Collar of Doom. As we've established, Ella Enchanted is a satire, and it does a lot of references to previous fairy tales that came before it. And so I feel like this costume choice for Hattie is like a nod towards the way that villains have been dressed in a lot of fairy tale media. With that said, Hattie's look is also way more historical than Ella's 2000s prom dress, which once again emphasizes Ella's modernist and contemporary likability versus the old washed-up Hattie. So there's a lot that can be said about fairy tale costuming that I haven't touched on in this video because it is just like an expansive topic. But something that's also really important to recognize is that characters are not just dressed a certain way. Like, the costume is only one aspect of creating a character. And for villains in particular, the way that they behave, their mannerisms, and also their physical features all work to uphold an extremely Western, Eurocentric, Christian ideal of what is bad. Most of the time, villains are also given like notably ethnic, mostly Jewish features, and especially in Disney movies, they're also queer-coded as well. On the flip side, historically, most of the time heroines are thin, fair, blonde, blue-eyed, and very dainty in their mannerisms. Anyway, this is the end of the video, so I would love to know your favorite fairy tale, 1, and 2, your favorite fairy tale film costuming. Actually, now that I think about it, there are a couple movies that I haven't talked about in this video, but that I highly recommend. So Mirror Mirror and Bram Stoker's Dracula, both of them were costumed by Eiko Ishioka. They are just like immaculately costumed. She really had an eye for detail and design. They're very avant-garde, but they still make sense, and they're just beautiful costumes, and I would like highly recommend if you have any interest in the subject at all, which I guess you do because you've made it all the way to the end. So check those out. That's your homework. Anyways, I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Over and out.